garrote. Doesn't sound nice, does it? No, and it's even worse in Spanish. Garrote, garrote vil. Well, my word is garrote, Garrote. And the reason you might know this word is from watching detective stories on television. So, for example, if somebody is sitting in the front seat of their car in the dark, and then suddenly you see these hands rising up, and they wind a belt or a scarf or something around the neck of the person in the front seat and pull from behind, that's actually garroting. And sometimes the investigating officer will say, oh, so-and-so, yes, they were garroted. And you might be there going, oh, what does that mean? Well, it's a particular kind of strangulation. Strangulation effected from behind. It doesn't matter with what. Sometimes it's done with a wire, sometimes a belt, sometimes a scarf, and sometimes it can be done actually with a specially made metal belt. In Spanish, garrote, the garrote actually originally and a long time ago, as a means of execution, what they used was a cudgel, a big fat cudgel, and this was a garrote. And so the method of execution was garroting. And then eventually, through a series of coincidences, I suppose, a more formal method of execution developed, which was called garroting. And this garroting actually involved strangulation from behind. And initially it would have been with a leather belt or with some form of very tough cloth. And the person being executed would normally be in a seated position, and the executioner would pull from behind. Sometimes they would twist a rod into the back of the cloth or the belt and then just wind it around so that it became tighter and tighter and tighter, and eventually you broke the person's neck. It became a formal judicial method of execution in Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. They made special chairs. A very simple chair with a flat seat, a straight back, no arms, and the straight back was more like a pole, and you could move a metal collar, specially made metal collar, up and down and fit it onto the neck of the person who was going to be garroted. And then there was a metal stick behind, which would be twisted around, and then the person would be garroted in that way. The reason it was introduced over a 30-year period from about 1812 to 1834 is because they believed that it was a much more humane method of execution than hanging. Up to then, any person who was not a member of the nobility in Spain would be executed by being hung from a gallows. And there was no trapdoor and no drop, so this was a very long and very painful method of execution. And the garrote was simply easier. You died faster. The last person to be executed using the garrote was in 1974, and this was for a capital offence. And it was finally formally abolished in 1977. The last civilian executions, that is, people executed for a civilian crime, civilian on civilian, took place in 1959. So it was an integral part of the Spanish judicial system up until really quite recently. But if you go back into the mists of time, back to the medieval period when Spain was divided into several competing kingdoms, there was a system in place whereby the garrote, even in its very primitive form of just being a kind of strangulation, was the method of execution for anyone who was not a member of the nobility. These were vile people, villanos in Spanish, so it was known as the garrote vil, the vile garrote, only to be used for a person who was not of consequence. If you were a person of consequence, a member of the nobility, you would be executed by being beheaded. I would imagine that these days most people would not be aware that the garrote was a formal method of execution, because certainly in Western Europe we don't have judicial execution in our consciousness, and if we do, we think about the American electric chair. So if you hear about somebody being garroted now, it is almost always a description, and usually in detective fiction or a detective series on the television, it's always a description of the method which was used to kill somebody, and it's always a sneaky method, always done from behind. And I would say the way it's presented in detective television series anyway, it always seems to be particularly cruel. And in fact, it's an irony, because when it was introduced in Spain as a method of executing people, it was introduced because it was seen as being kinder overall to the victim.